The Holy Gospel according to St. John, the 11th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." The Gospel of the Lord. So today on the church calendar, we celebrate all the saints. That is, in biblical terms, all of the people, both living and dead, who have lived in faith and been servants of Jesus. It's especially a time when we remember those who have died and gone before us, but it is also a time to remember that each one of us is called right now to be a saint in the life of the world around us. So I always think it's cool when we read the story of the raising of Lazarus on All Saints Sunday. It happens once every 3 years, because after all, Lazarus is both a saint who was dead and a saint who was alive. He gets to be both in today's gospel reading. And yet, we don't really know very much about Lazarus. He appears only in the 11th and 12th chapters of John's Gospel, where he is introduced along with his sisters, Mary and Martha, as people who are especially close to Jesus. Lazarus is ill, and his sisters send word to Jesus that he should come and heal him. But Jesus sits tight for a while and doesn't head out until he knows that Lazarus is already dead. When Jesus and his disciples get to Bethany, which is just outside of Jerusalem, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, which is where today's story picks up. Jesus tells Martha to then move the stone away from the entrance to the tomb, which she reluctantly does because of the stench of a dead body. And then Jesus calls out to Lazarus, who miraculously returns to life and comes out of the tomb. And yet, Lazarus, as opposed to Mary and Martha, has no speaking part in this story or anywhere else in John's Gospel. And while the Gospel recounts the impact of this event on the crowds and on Mary and Martha, and even on the surrounding community, we don't really ever get Lazarus' perspective on what just happened to him. And so on this All Saints Sunday, I thought it might be good to consider for a moment what it must have meant for Lazarus to be a saint. That is, to be someone who, after being called back to life by Jesus, was called to live in faith and continue to be a servant of Jesus. What would it mean to be a saint from the perspective of Lazarus? Of course, nobody in the story actually asks him, but it seems to me that being a saint from Lazarus' perspective had to have meant living with a deep understanding of grace in his life. Because after all, Lazarus did nothing to contribute to this miracle. He wasn't even the one who called for help. And he was literally dead. He couldn't even physically hear the voice of Jesus calling him back to life. But I suspect that for the rest of his life, Lazarus lived with a sense that in Jesus, God would love him and find him and help him even when he couldn't do a thing to help himself or change the outcome of the situation he was in. And that had to affect how he lived into his newfound life. That's really what grace is about. Understanding that God's help and love are there for you even when you cannot help yourself, even when you cannot even ask for it.
being a saint, from Lazarus' perspective, had to also mean living with hope. Because after all, Lazarus had been dead, and not even death had separated him from the love of God in Christ Jesus. For him, that verse from Romans wouldn't have simply been a hope for the future, but an actual lived experience. And it also didn't mean that all of his problems were behind him. Because we read this story that I just read some years in Lent and once every 3 years on All Saints Sunday, but we never, ever read this little section at the end of chapter 11, at the very beginning of chapter 12. Just after this story, Jesus is back at the home of Lazarus and Martha and Mary, and he's having dinner. And this is what John says during that moment. When the great crowd of Jews from the Passover crowds in Jerusalem learned that Jesus was there, they came not only because of Jesus, but also to see Lazarus, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So, the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death as well, since it was on account of him that many of the Jews were deserting and believing in Jesus. So you got to feel sorry for Lazarus at this point. I mean, he's just been raised from the dead, and suddenly there is a plot to kill him. He lives, maybe for the rest of his life, in a dangerous and life-threatening situation. But this time he faces it knowing that even if they succeed in killing him, because we don't know if they did, it will not be the end. It will not be the end of him, and that is what living in hope is really all about. And living as a saint, from the perspective of Lazarus, had to mean also living in community. Because after all, even though Lazarus was raised from the dead by Jesus, he is still tied up. Apparently, he could sort of hop his way out of the tomb. You get the sense that this guy's kind of doing this kind of thing as he's trying to figure out how to get out of the tomb. But he's bound up with his hands and his feet and his face, and he couldn't do much. And he couldn't do anything until the community of Jesus' followers unbound him and let him go. And I suspect that Lazarus, in being unbound and set free, understood that part of his job in living as a saint meant that he was now unbound so that he could return to be part of the community that set others free, whether from physical, spiritual, or emotional bonds. And it is always the case in all the stories about Jesus healing people, whether it's from sickness, from loneliness, from death, that they are freed so that they can return to community and share what they've received with others. So on this All Saints Sunday, the perspective of Lazarus can also help us to follow Jesus and live as saints in our own time and place. Because whether or not we experience any kind of stupendous miracle in our lives, as followers of Jesus, we're all called to be saints by being people who live by grace. And that's important in a culture in which we are almost always earning what we get or arguing about what it is that we're actually entitled to. I'm sure most of you know that the expression, God helps those who help themselves, is Ben Franklin. It's not the Bible, right? Everybody knows this. And yet, often we live like maybe God just needs a little bit of a hand from us. We give God some advice on what God should do to help us out and what we really need. But Lazarus literally hears and receives the voice of Jesus when he is dead. Even when he cannot help himself at all, Jesus helps him. And sometimes I've read Christian self-help stuff about how you can listen for and hear the voice of Jesus in your life and figure out God's purpose for your life. And I get it. I'm guilty of, I preach about this sometimes. I talk about how we can be open to listening for the voice of Jesus, but sometimes some of the things that I read give you the impression that God has placed a secret code somewhere in the Bible or somewhere out there, someplace that if you're very good and you try real hard, you will find it. And then you will know what God wants. Yet, while being attentive is good, when Jesus wants Lazarus to hear his voice, Jesus does it, even when Lazarus cannot physically hear. And trusting that Jesus will do the same for you is often what living in grace each day is all about. For us too, we are called to be saints by living like Lazarus in that we live with hope. Thing is, for us, hope is often a pretty weak word. We use it in ways like, oh, I hope it's not going to rain when we have an outdoor event. It's just kind of a wish. But hope for Lazarus was confidence. Not that no bad thing would happen, because clearly bad things continued to happen for him, but that the bad things wouldn't finally win out, not even if they succeeded in killing him. That would not be the end. And for us, living in hope is about living with confidence that God's love and power are stronger than whatever chaos or problems we're going through at the moment. And that as long as Jesus is there for us and caring for us, it really is not the end, even if our preferred candidates do not win this week. And living as saints, from the perspective of Lazarus, as Jesus calls us to do, is also about living in community. One of the really horrible things about death is that you have been cut off from the community of your loved ones. And when Lazarus was revived from death, he returned to community. He was at meals with everyone. He didn't go off and sit by himself. And for us, experiencing grace and hope and even resurrection right now is more often found when we participate in the community of believers instead of continuing to lie in a cave by ourselves. I have read lots of articles, and you probably have too, about how loneliness is sort of epidemic in our society right now. Often that's been linked to people lacking communities, both religious and social, where they can find meaning and purpose and connection outside of themselves. And for us, the community of Jesus is a community where we can both experience being unbound from being alone, as well as one in which we can be Jesus' agents of unbinding others. So today we remember saints, like Lazarus, who have gone before us. But even more than that, the voice of Jesus calls us to be saints in our own time and place. And often we learn what that means by remembering the perspective of saints like Lazarus. And being a saint like Lazarus doesn't mean we need to have a unique, miraculous experience in our lives, but it does mean that we're called to be followers of Jesus who rely on God's grace instead of our own strength. Being a saint means living in hope even when things get bad and knowing that it is really not the end. And being a saint means living together in community in such a way that we can be unbound and empowered to be people who unbind others by sharing the grace and the hope that we found in Jesus.